Progress.
Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Yevamot Daf Kaf Vav. We're going to continue, we're going to actually finish the second parak, continue with this interesting topic we began yesterday about people who are suspected of having of lying in order to be able to be in a relationship with a woman, lying about either that she's divorced, lying, right, that she had a valid divorce, lying that her husband died, lying that he basically forbade her to her husband based on a vow, right? Certain situations where basically we're worried that he's doing this in order to make her a free woman so that he can marry her. So now the Mishnah is going to be all of a sudden permitting in certain cases. The Mishnah at the top of Kafav says, "V'kulan shayu lahem nashim v'metu mutarot linaseh lahem." If they had wives, and meaning if this person was happily married, or we don't know happily or not, but he was married, and his wife just happened to die, then mutarot linaseh lahem. We're not worried that he killed his wife just to do this. It reminds me of a movie, Black Widow, where she basically keeps killing her husbands in order to get their money, right? And nobody really suspects her because nobody really thinks. It takes them a while to get onto her because nobody really thinks that people kill their spouses for, money, for relationships with other people, right? It's not common. So therefore, we're not worried. And likewise, kulan shenisu lacherim, he permitted her to go marry everybody else. She's just forbidden to him. So if they married other people, and then in the interim, once he permitted her, she went and married somebody else. Vinit garshonit almanu, and then she got divorced or widowed. Mutarot linaseh lahem. At that point, they can already marry them. We saw this 2 pages ago, where we just had with the woman who was divorced in between, right? Married someone else and was divorced when there was a suspicion with Shimon, right, with the other person, and then she then marries him, right? Then there's less of a concern if she was with someone in the interim. V'kulan mutarot libnehem olachehem, and not only that, but if they permit them, they're only forbidden to them. They're not forbidden to their close relatives, like their brothers or their sons. We'll see later why doesn't it mention fathers. We'll see later what exactly the concern is, right? You would think the concern is that maybe he's lying on their behalf. That doesn't seem to me what the Gemara thinks is the concern. The Gemara thinks the concern is, and then in the end they permit it, it's not a concern at all. But the reason why they need to mention it is because maybe if it's your brother, you're going to see her a lot, and if you really have a thing for her, then maybe you'll end up having a relationship with her, and maybe we should avoid you having such close contact with her. So we're also going to compare it to another similar case where we do forbid relatives, and here we don't, and why is that? So the Gemara first, there's 3 sections to this Gemara until we finish the second chapter. Metu'i nitgar shulo. So the first line was, if they had wives, and then their wives died, it seems like if their wives died, but not if they got divorced, because presumably if they got divorced, right, the man divorces his wife. Well, why did he divorce his wife if not to get to this other woman? It's definitely reason to suspect when there's divorce. So Amalei Rav Hillel Rav Ashi, wait a minute, V'hatanya afilu nitgarshu, but this inference contradicts an explicit braita. Even if they got divorced, he could still marry her. So lo kasha, the Gemara says, don't worry. Ha dehavek tata, ha delavek tata. This is when there was a conflict between them already, and this is when there wasn't a conflict between them. Actually, I shouldn't even say already. Let's just say conflict between them versus no conflict between them. This is a very strange answer because, as often happens with this, when we say one is in this case, one is in that case, there's a big debate about which is which. If he was already fighting with his wife beforehand, then maybe there's more likely that he actually had eyes for this other woman, and that's why he was fighting with his wife. And that's when you're not allowed. But you are allowed if there was no fighting between him and his wife, and then, they got divorced, presumably for some other reason. Well, obviously, that sounds a little weird. Why were they getting divorced? Some people say, right, and if they just got divorced without this fighting, well, then he can marry the other woman. Some people say, no, it's the exact opposite. If they were fighting all the time anyway, then it's not because of this woman that they were getting divorced, in which case he can marry the other woman if he wants later. But if there was no fighting before, and then all of a sudden they just go and get divorced, right? He says, oh, listen, I want to divorce you, and gives her a get. Well, then maybe it's because of this other woman. Then it would be forbidden. So that's the opposite. The Meiri takes a different stance, and that's why I stopped myself when I said when I said it before about they were fighting before. The Meiri says maybe were they fighting after or not? In other words, if there was fighting, there was no fighting before, but then the fighting started after he testified against her, then maybe there's concern, or around that time, that he's doing it to make a fight with her so that they could get divorced so that he can marry the other woman. So that's a third possible. It's not exactly a third possibility, but it's a different way of understanding it. So it's an interesting thing in and of itself, how much, right, what would cause one to be more suspicious or not. Fighting, yes, fighting, no fighting. Anyway, that's just interesting. Beit ema, hava hadelo avik tata, Maybe it's where there wasn't any fighting really beforehand. And now the issue is when they go to get divorced now, v'lo kashya, hada argil hu, hada argila he. Who's the one who's really initiating the breakup? Which is interesting because this shows women were initiating divorce also. Who's the one who's starting the fights? Is it she starting the fights or is it he starting the fights? If she's starting the fights, then we're not really suspicious of him that he's gone with some other woman. Unless, of course, she's starting the fights because she's suspicious of him. But the assumption here is she's the one who starts to be unhappy in the marriage, as opposed to him being unhappy in the marriage. If he's unhappy in the marriage, that's an indicator because maybe he has eyes on some other woman. If she is, right, this whole sugya in general is very interesting in terms of making assumptions about human behavior, which is fascinating in and of itself. And what assumptions we can make that would cause us to be suspicious or not. Wait till we get to the end of this sugya, which is actually going to be a little bit difficult to swallow as well, but hold off, we're almost there. V'kulan shenisu. Now the second part we're going to deal with is if they married other people and then got divorced or widowed, then they can marry him. So again, the Gemara says, well, they're going to make an assumption and then question that assumption. We thought when we read this, mita v'girushin. Now we're going to get off on a totally different topic, which is the topic of chazaka. How many times you need to do something to establish it as this is a done deal, and then there's all sorts of ramifications. There's a big basic machloket: is it 2 times or 3 times? Something happens 3 times, we assume it's going to happen. That's what we call chazaka. But Rebbi holds it's even after 2 times. What does this have to do with anything? So let's go back and see. They assumed, now this is a strange assumption why they would assume this, but maybe it just means you assume it could be read this way, which means that mita. There were different cases. Either he testified that her husband died in the previous Mishnayot, or that they got divorced. So if he testified that they died, and then she marries someone else and he died, okay, that could be a possibility. And another possibility was, or he testified that she was divorced, and then she married someone else and got divorced. Again, whether or not you have to assume that they thought that was the case, or at least that could be the case, right? It seems reasonable that those are possibilities, because there's all sorts of permutation. He testified she was divorced, and then she got married and widowed, or he testified her husband was dead, and then she went and got married and got divorced, right? We could do that. We could do all the possibilities. Or mita, it was both about death or both about divorce. What's the difference? What's the relevance? Well, there's a halacha that if a woman, this goes back to the Black Widow movie, if a woman has a husband who dies, she's married twice and the husband dies twice, then there's an issue. Okay, now, only if you hold by Rebbi, but if it happens 3 times, then she's muchzeket as a woman whose husband's dying, you're not supposed to marry her. But if the chazaka is at 2 times, then you can't marry her after 2 deaths. So this would basically mean, okay, that according to this, if you say it's mita, and then he can marry her, that means obviously nema madnitin to lo Rebbi. We could say our Mishna doesn't hold like Rebbi, because Rebbi wouldn't allow the marriage because she already has 2 husbands dead. So, right, I don't think it's that they're worried necessarily he's killing her, but maybe it's a little bit of superstition, that this happened already 3 times. She's killed 3 husbands, or according to Rebbi 2, right, maybe she's, for whatever reason, something's causing their death. Right? If it's Rebbi holds 2 times the chazaka, and then we would say our Mishna doesn't hold like him. So they say, lo, mita gerushin v'gerushin amita. You could say, it's talking about a case where one was about death and one was about divorce. Or one was about divorce and the other was about death. The other one was about death. So it could be explained in other ways, and therefore it doesn't prove anything about Rebbi or not. Generally, we don't hold like Rebbi. Chazaka is 3 times, not 2. V'kulan mutarot libnehem ola achehem. So now they want to know, how is it different from the following Mishnah? Hanit'an mina isha. If somebody is suspected of being with another woman, so we say it's actually, it says Hatnan, but I think it's a Tosefta. It's in the Tosefta. Someone suspected of sleeping with another woman, asul bi'ima u'bibitao ba'achota. He's not allowed to sleep with her mother, her sister, or her daughter. Okay, her mother, her daughter, her sister. Now, what's the issue? Right? It means like he can't marry them. What's the concern of marrying any relative of hers? Right? We don't know really if he had a relationship with her, but we have rumors. We're worried that what's going to happen, if she goes to their house a lot, because she's close with her mother, her sister, her daughter, she hangs out there a lot, then he'll be around her a lot, and he might end up in a relationship with her, right? If he really has an eye for her and they were suspected of having done something together before, there's more concern of it if, right? He shouldn't marry any of her close relatives because they'll be in proximity to each other. So here, why are we not concerned about that? In this case, we say he can marry. The woman can marry his brother or his brother or his son. So why do we not allow it in the woman case? So they're going to make a bunch of different assumptions about women and men. Some of them will be okay to swallow. Some of them may be a little difficult. This I could get. Women are more likely to be at their sister's house, at their mother's house, or their daughter's house, but men much less likely. Why? First of all, think about their society. In their society, the women were home all day doing the laundry, doing the water from the well. They probably lived not far from each other, and they were often in each other's houses, taking care of the children together, sharing the tasks. Whereas the men were out working in the shuk, in the marketplace, in boats, and they were traveling. They didn't have as much free time to be going hanging out in people's houses. So if your son is married to this woman that you have eyes for, you're not so much in your son's house. It's not such a big deal. But if you have eyes for your wife's mother and she comes to the house a lot, there's likelihood that something might happen. That's the first answer. Inami, this is a little more difficult. There's no, I'll put it in halachic terms because I think it makes the most sense that way. It's hard to understand in emotional terms. But in halachic terms, and this is really what the Gemara is saying, women don't forbid other women on them. What does that mean? That means if a man is married to a woman and he has eyes for his mother, and while his mother comes to visit, he sleeps with the mother, okay? Or worse, right? He's married to the mother and he molests the daughter. Okay, we're talking about the daughter of the mother, not his own daughter. So now, right, in the field, right, we can view this, the most, where my mind wanders to is child molesting, right? Or things like that, or relative molesting, because it's the most common thing. It happens in the house because people are in the house all the time. This is really, it's disturbing, but it's actually super relevant today because this, unfortunately, really still goes on. So what they're saying here is like this. If this is happening in the woman's house where her husband's with some other woman, right, her relative, she's not going to, okay, now again, it's very difficult to say this, lokapdea hadade. She's not going to stop him really. Now, why not? Because halachically, there's no relevance to her. Why? If he sleeps with her daughter, okay, she doesn't, right, normally, if she's we're going to see the flip side. If she's a married woman and some man sleeps with her, she has to get divorced from her first husband and she has to get divorced from the person who had relations with her now. So that's going to mess up the husband. But here it doesn't mess up the wife, really. I mean, the truth is you're not allowed to sleep with a woman and her daughter, so I don't really know how we get around that one. But the fact is, it doesn't mean that she's going to have to divorce her. So because of that, she's not going to make a big issue of it. One other way to view it is unfortunately, which happens very often, is the mother just doesn't, right, if let's say the father's molesting a child in the house, like let's say it's not his child and it's her child, she'll turn her face sometimes. It's unfortunate, it's horrible, and it's horrible to think that this would go on. But it unfortunately does, right? Sometimes the husband's more strong in the house and she doesn't know what to say to him and she kind of suspects something's going on, but she doesn't really know how to or what to, or she just doesn't notice, which is also a possibility. But here, they're saying because it doesn't affect her in any way. Now, of course it affects her. It affects her emotionally. It affects her in so many ways. But in a halachic way, she won't have to get divorced, so she's going to do less about it. Again, this is very difficult sugya to swallow. But gavrin da asrin shchibatana adade kapta adade. But if this guy comes in, let's say you're the man of the house, and you have this woman that you're married to, your wife, and then comes in your father, who has eyes for your wife, you're going to make sure that he doesn't sleep with your wife, because if so, you're going to have to divorce her, right? You're the man, remember. So you're going to have to divorce her. Of course you're going to make sure that doesn't happen, because that's the halacha. You're going to have to divorce your wife if she was with some other man. So because of that, Kapte Hadadi is never going to let this kind of thing happen. Plus, men are a bit tougher about this, right? In terms of, again, especially in those days, right? Not to say the women, I'm sure there's plenty of women who would make a big deal about this. I'm not saying no women would, but they're saying as a general rule, and certainly in their society, things were very different. So then the Gemara says, well, Lihachi Aviv Nami, why doesn't it put his father on the list? That would be also, right, his father can marry because there's less, right, his father's not going to tolerate his son sleeping with his wife, so why wouldn't you put that on the list? So they say lo mebaya. It's included in there. It just didn't bother saying it because it's obvious. Lo mebaya aviv debazes b'nei minei. The son is certainly embarrassed in front of his father to do this. He has respect for his father. Of course, he's not going to sleep with his father's wife. Aval beno to lebazes aviv minei. But maybe the son, who may be, right, a son who would be nervous to do something and say something against his father, Emalo, you might have thought not. Kamash Malan. The Mishnah is telling you even a son is going to stop his father from doing that and make sure have a no tolerance policy when it comes to his father coming into his house trying to sleep with his wife. Okay, again, this whole thing you would imagine people don't have a tolerance policy for any of it, but the Gemara tries to make these distinctions, men and women. Again, number one, I want to just put in perspective of their society. Number two, I want to say that there's a difference. Sometimes the Gemara comes up with theories, like we did before with the ktata, where they come up with a theory, you can prove it this way, you can prove it that way. It's not the most convincing answer. It's just a way to resolve a contradiction. Maybe there's other ways and they just didn't realize what they were, but these are just possible answers. It doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean they act upon these things. They're just trying to kind of establish, when we have contradictory sources, how can we resolve them? And they come up with creative ways to resolve them. Doesn't always necessarily mean that that is a fact, okay? They're using it as a theory to try to come up with how can we resolve a contradiction. So you can also view the sugya a little bit in that way and then say, oh, well, it's not necessarily the truth. It's just a possible way of understanding things. And with that, Hadranah Ketzad Eshet Achiv, and then a very strange place. Anyway, we're now going to start our new Mishnah, which we've actually seen a number of times. So I'm hoping at this point, this case will be very clear to you because we've seen it a bunch of times and now we're going to review it and see it inside. Arba'a achim. Shnai mehem nisuot shte achayot. So we have four brothers, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. And two of them are married to two sisters, Rachel and Leah. So now, what happens? So Reuven marries Rachel, Shimon marries Leah, and Yehuda and Levi are just there. Now, Hare Elu, so now, Umetu Hanisuim et Achayot. Reuven and Shimon die. We actually saw two different possibilities. Is this that they died at the same time, or is it that they died one after the other? But either way, Hare Elu Cholsot V'lo Mityabmot. What happens? When Reuven and Shimon die, Rachel and Leah both have zika to Levi. This is at least the first way to understand our Mishnah. And Rachel and Leah have zika to Yehuda, because each one has two sisters. You can't marry achotz kukato, right? Two sisters on a D'Rabbanan level, and there, right? You can't marry. You can't marry two sisters on the Torah level, but you can't. If you have zika to one, you can't marry the other. That's D'Rabbanan because zika is all D'Rabbanan. So therefore, you do chalitza to both women. Okay, they have to do chalitza. They can't marry them. The im can move a kinsu. What if they didn't really know the halacha? And Levi got up and did yibum with Rachel, and Yehuda did Levi with Leah. Now remember, when they marry one of them, the zika of her to the other person is gone. So at this point, it actually could be okay, but, right, im can move a kansu yotziu. They basically say, no, you have to divorce them, okay? Because, right, you're not allowed to, basically, the issue is that you went against the halacha here, and we don't let you stay married. For Rabbi Eliezer, but you could see why there would be a machloket, because theoretically you could say, well, there's no zika anymore, right? So, or you could say maybe there's no zika at all, in which case it's not a problem. So Rabbi Eliezer, Beit Shamai kayem, Beit Hillel yotziu. According to Beit Shamai, this actually works. You could stay married; it's not a problem. And Beit Hillel says, no, you actually have to divorce them. Okay, you can't stay married to them. Okay, so now I want to point out two things. First of all, it's interesting. Rabbi Eliezer, it's not clear if he's the only one who thinks they argue about this. Some people say, why is he bringing Beit Shammai's opinion if we don't hold that way? Some people say it's because maybe some people think that Beit Hillel was the one who said that and they flipped the opinion, so he wants to say this is the tradition. Maybe Tanakama agrees with him, and he's just specifying that what Tanakama brought is only Beit Hillel's opinion, just so you know Beit Shammai disagrees, which is very similar to the first chapter, where we learned all about the tzarot, and then we said, oh, Beit Shammai doesn't hold by this at all. So anyway, Beit Shammai says you can stay married, Beit Hillel says you can't. What if Rachel was forbidden to Levi? So Rachel is married to Reuven, Leah is married to Shimon, and what happens when Reuven and Shimon die? Rachel only has zika to Yehuda, not to Levi, because she's an Isur Erva to Levi, right? She could be his daughter or something like that, who married her uncle, Reuven originally, and now she doesn't have any zika to Levi. Leah still has zika to Yehuda and to Levi. So what happens? So Yehuda can't marry either one of them. But Levi can marry Leah because, right? Because what's the issue? Levi and Leah only has zika. Levi only has zika to Leah and not to Rachel. So because of that, mutar ba'achota, right? So let's read it again. If one of them is forbidden to the other, then echad isur erva. Al echad isur erva. Asul ba umutar ba'achota. Okay, so Levi is forbidden to Rachel because it's isur erva, but permitted to Leah. V'hasheni, but Yehuda, because he has zika of two sisters on him, is asul b'shtehen. He can't marry either one of them because Rachel, even though she's forbidden to Levi, she still has to do yibum with Yehuda, and therefore the zika of both. Next, hayta echad mehen asura al ha'echad isur mitzva v'isur kedusha. Remember this? This is either, right? Assuming we go with the Mishnah's interpretation, isur mitzvah is shniyot, right? The derabbanans, and isur kedusha is that it's an isurei lav. She can't marry. Then that already we said is a different category. Choletze v'lo mityabenet. So now what happens? So if she is mitzvah or kedusha, now we have a bit of an issue. I had a hard time trying to figure out how to draw this with zika because there's doraita and there's derabbanan. On a derabbanan level, she can't marry any one of them. But on a Torah level, she actually can marry them because she's not prohibited midoraita to marry them. So on a Torah level, there's zika to both. On a rabbinic level, she actually can't marry Levi. So because of that, Leah has to do chalitza. Because again, she has a problem that maybe she's zakuk to both, and therefore we have an issue. So now, based on this, right, also, by the way, Rachel would do chalitza in that case. Okay, so they both have to do chalitza because there's things going on a rabbinic level and things going on a Torah level, and they seem to contradict, right? On a Torah level, theoretically, they could both do yibum. On a rabbinic level, one can, one can't, okay? So we're going to end up saying, basically, right, on a rabbinic level, it's like the previous case, where in the end, Leah really could do yibum. But because of the Torah level, where they both actually have zika, so we don't allow it at all, and we only allow chalitza, and in fact, they both do chalitza in this case, because remember, isur mitzvah, isur kedusha, you always do chalitza. That was what we saw when we talked about the shniyot. They always have to do chalitza. Okay, that's the first part of the Mishnah. Now we get to this other case. And that's not actually the first part, I don't know why I said that. We're already into the second part of the Mishnah, but now, an outgrowth of this case. Called both, because here they're going to be both isur erva. And here's a case that we brought already. We had this case. This is that complicated asura lezeh muteret lezeh on daf tet. I think it was on the end of daf tet and bet. We saw it a few times, I think, already. But let's assume I took the case of a mother-in-law. So Rachel and Leah are sisters. Rachel has a daughter Re'ut, and Leah has a daughter Livnat. So now the outgrowth of this case of two sisters married to two brothers, their two daughters were married to the other two brothers. Okay, so if echad mehen asura al zeh isur erva, v'ashniya asura al zeh isur erva. So how could we have an erva case? Okay, in the other case, I didn't give you how she's erva. I just said she's erva. But here I thought it was better if we kind of played out the whole thing. So I gave a particular case of erva. So if Re'ut and Livnat each marry, okay, the R goes with R and L goes with L. So Livnat is Leah's daughter and Re'ut is Rachel's daughter. So if Rachel marries Reuven and Re'ut marries Levi, and Livnat marries Yehuda and Leah is married to Shimon, okay, so they're all married to the four brothers. When Reuven and Shimon die, what happens? Rachel and Leah fall to yibum to Yehuda and Levi, but Rachel can't marry Levi because he's married to her daughter, and Leah can't marry Yehuda because he's married to her daughter, right? For him, it's his mother-in-law. He can't marry her. Therefore, there's only zika from Rachel to Yehuda because she can't marry Levi, and there's only zika from Leah to Levi because she can't marry Yehuda, and therefore we'd end up saying, right, asura lezeh muteret lezeh, the one who's forbidden to one is permitted to the other, and the one who's asura lezeh muteret lezeh, the one who's forbidden to Leah is permitted to, the one who Leah is prohibited to is, now I got a little confusing. Each one is permitted to the one that the other one is prohibited to. Okay, so Rachel can marry Yehuda and not Levi, and Leah can marry Levi and not Yehuda. Okay, that's our case. Okay, so that's the end of the Mishnah. So, and then we forgot to read the last words. V'zoi shambru, and this is the case that they say. There's a word on the street about this case is This is the case of achota, keshehi yevibta. We saw this before, right? Her sister, who is her yivama, meaning they both fall to yibum to the same people. O choletzet o mityabenet. She can even do yibum in this case, even though she's her sister. Normally, sisters can't do yibum; they have to do chalitza, like we saw in the first case in the Mishnah. But this is an exception to the rule because each one is forbidden to the other one. Therefore, they can do it. Gemara, shmami now, and now we're going to understand. And this is a good review of what we saw already. One can infer from here, yesh zika, right? Everything I showed you on those charts was all based on zika, right? If there wasn't zika, this all wouldn't be relevant. If you weren't, again, what's zika? You're connected to the husband you're supposed to be marrying, right? The man you're supposed to be marrying. It's as if he's your husband already. That's why Levi and Yehuda both had zika from two women because they were supposed to marry them. There's already a connection. If there was no connection, there would be no problem. To eat ain't zika, because if there wasn't zika, miftehane mitre batekaten. Leah and Rachel come from two different spouses. So each brother, right, or each brother should do yibum with the other, right? They can't marry both. But Levi can marry one, right, Leah, and Yehuda can marry Rachel, assuming there's no erva, a regular case. No problem, because there is, one does yibum for Reuven and one does yibum for Shimon. If there's no zika, they're not connected to the other woman, unless they did yibum, and they didn't do yibum with them, right? You do yibum with one and not the other. Each one could just do yibum on the other. It should be fine. So now the Gemara says, no. No, I can explain it with ein zika. We've seen this before already. It's review. We're worried that if we allow, let's say, Rachel to do yibum with Levi, what might happen? We might mess up the whole mitzvah of yibum for Leah. Why? Before Yehuda does yibum with Leah, maybe Yehuda will die. Remember we talked about this, the warrior. If Yehuda were to die, what would happen? Leah will fall to yibum to Levi. Levi's already married to her sister Rachel, because he did yibum with her. He won't be able to do yibum with her until end up being exempt without anything, and which is okay. But we end up missing the opportunity to do yibum. We'd rather just say both do chalitza so that we don't have that problem. To which the Gemara says, well, then you could have just given a case where there were only three brothers to begin with, and they both fall to one brother, and one, right, we basically should say he should do chalitza to both, because better to do that than to be mevatel mitzvah yibum, and he shouldn't do yibum to one of them. Would have been the same things. They say, well, lo mebaya kamrina. Lo mebaya tzvata devadai batla mitzvah yivamim. If there's one, then of course batla mitzvah yivamim. But but maybe you'd say, why should we worry that maybe Yehuda's going to die in between before he does yibum? What's the likelihood that after the first one does yibum, before he gets to do yibum, he's going to die? It's unlikely. That's why the Mishnah gave us the case of 4. Teach you, even in that case, we're going to worry. So, if that's so, chamishanami. Well, then, if you're worried and you're worried about all possibilities, we should be worried also in the case of 5. Why didn't it tell us 5 brothers? And even if there's 3, maybe Yehuda and Yisachar will die. To which the Gemara says, "Lemita ditre lo chashina." No, that part we're not going to worry. We're not going to worry that 2 brothers are going to die. If there's 5 brothers, then we're going to allow it. And that's only if we hold ein zika. So we have 2 tracks, either yesh zika, and that's the whole premise of the Mishnah, or ein zika, and the concern is mitzvah levatel mitzvah yivamim, sur levatel mitzvah yivamim. We can't do something which might cause the whole mitzvah of yibum to go out the window, and that would be if Yehuda were to die. Or obviously, if there's only 3 brothers and one would do it, and then it would prevent the other, right? It would prevent the other wife from getting yibum, so we wouldn't do that either. Amar Rabba bar Avuna Amar Rav. Now we're going to start another case, okay, which we're going to start today. We're going to see Rav, and then we're going to see Shmuel on it. Shmuel, we're only going to start a little bit today. We're going to have a much better interpretation of him tomorrow. We're going to really try to understand, and we're going to have 2 different interpretations. Rav here, we're going to have first an assumption about what he says, and then we're going to change the assumption and switch it into a different case because we're going to have a problem with the first understanding. This case, we have 5 brothers and we have 3 sisters. So Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, and Tamar, Ruth, and Yael. So Shlosha Chayot Yevamot Shenaflu Lifnei Shnei Achim Yevamim. Okay, now what happens? Zeh choletz lechat, v'zeh choletz lechat. Okay, so 3 are married to 3 brothers, and then we're left with Reuven and Shimon. Usually our cases are Reuven and Shimon are married. In this case, I did it differently because you'll see the Gemara is going to use Reuven and Shimon later. So as the people who have to do yibum. So that's why I left it different. That's why I made it different this time. So now what happens? So 3 sisters, Yevamot, naflu lifnei shnei achim. They fall to yibum to 2 brothers. Because what happens? There's 5 brothers. 3 of the brothers die, the ones who are married. Their 3 wives fall to yibum to Reuven and Shimon. So now, zika, what does that mean? Through zika, Tamar has zika to Reuven and Shimon. Ruth has zika to Reuven and Shimon. And Yael has zika to Reuven and Shimon. So now what happens? What do? So, we take the first 2. Reuven does chalitza to Tamar. Shimon does chalitza to Ruth. And it doesn't really matter the order here, because we're assuming right now all the brothers died at the same time. Reuven does chalitza to one. Shimon does chalitza to the other, because we already learned. In this case, because they have zika of 2 women on it. At this point, Yael has zika to Reuven and Shimon. What's the issue here? The issue is like this. At this point, Reuven and Shimon really shouldn't do chalitza. Can't do yibum to Yael. Why can't they do yibum? Because this is what we call achot chalutzato. Okay? Theoretically, both brothers have zika, but they've gotten rid of the zika of Tamar, they've gotten rid of the zika of Ruth. Theoretically, they could marry Yael, but there's a separate problem, which is a durabanan. We've talked about this before. Achot chalutzato. If you do chalitza to a sister of hers, it's as if you were kind of married to them, which means you can't marry their sister. So, unless Tamar or Ruth were to die, they can't do yibum with Yael. So, if they don't do yibum, what do? They do chalitza, obviously. But what's the problem? Rav is going to raise this issue that when you do chalitza when you can't do yibum, okay, yibum is always, you're supposed to do yibum, but you do chalitza instead. It's a replacement. But if you do it in a way that you couldn't have done yibum, and you do chalitza as a last resort because you can't do yibum, then your chalitza is what's called, in the learned words of the Gemara, we're going to see it soon, chalitza psula, which doesn't mean, usually psula means disqualified, it's just a weakened chalitza. So let's just see what happens here. Reuven does chalitza with Yael. That's called the chalitza psula because Tamar already did chalitza with her sister. So he's not really allowed to marry Yael. If he can't marry Yael, his chalitza is weaker. What does it mean it's weaker? Well, it cut the zika between Reuven and Yael. You see, it's not there anymore, just the chalitza shoe. But the connection between her and Shimon doesn't get erased by this chalitza. It's not strong enough. So that's why it says, Reuven and Shimon each need to do chalitza with the last one. It says emtsai, which means the middle. What it means is the one who was left at the end, really. Okay? There's the one on this side, the one on that side, the one in the middle who didn't have chalitza yet. She needs chalitza from both. That's what Rabba says. Rabba bar Rav Huna says in the name of Rav. Comes Rabba, Amarle Rabba. Rabba says to him, Midika Amarta emtsa, and now he's going to explain this, okay? Which I already explained, but it was hard to read through that without explaining it. So now he's going to explain. He says, Midika Amarta emtsa itzricha chalitza mishnehem. Kasafarki yesh zika. It must be you hold that there's zika, because that whole thing doesn't make sense if you didn't hold zika. The whole reason to make her do chalitza from both is to get rid of the zika. And you'd also have to say, V'havi ala chalitza psula. And the chalitza between Reuven and Yael was only a weakened one, which is why she needed another chalitza from Shimon. B'chalitza psula, you must hold tzarich lachzor kol achim. When you do a weakened chalitza, it must mean Yael has to go to all the other brothers. So if there were 5 more brothers, she'd have to get chalitza from all of them. But I have a question on that, comes Rabbi, and he says, Ihachi kamai tanami. Then Reuven should have had to do chalitza with Tamar, Yael, and Ruth. And Shimon would have to do chalitza with Tamar, Yael, and Ruth because all their husbands died at the same time. Which means from the beginning, they were all connected. He couldn't have married any of them. And if he couldn't have married any of them, any of their chalitzas were only chalitza psula, because there was no potential for yibum, which means that in all these cases, they should have to do chalitza from both of the men. So, to which he answers, if the case is as we said, then you're right. Then this picture is wrong. And Reuven would have to do chalitza to both. Reuven would have to do chalitza to all 3 women. And Shimon would have to do chalitza to all 3 women. You're right. But, what I was talking about is, it's when they fell to yibum one after the other. Meaning, okay, Levi dies first, for example. Tamar, his wife, Reuven does chalitza with Tamar right away. Which means when he did chalitza, before the next brother died, there was no achot kukato. She didn't have a sister that was also stuck to, right, with zika to Ruvain, or to Shimon, right, I guess to Ruvain, in which case it's a perfectly good chalitza because theoretically you could have even married her. Now, the next thing that happens is Yehuda dies. And then, let's read inside. Nafal chada, chalatz la Ruvain. Right, so after the first one dies, Ruvain does chalitza to her. Nafla idach, the second one dies. Notice they don't have names in the Gemara, but Ruth dies. Nafla, right, nafla idach, so the second one falls to Yibum. Chalatz la Shimon. Shimon does chalitza with Ruth. Nafla idach, now when Yisachar dies, we're left with Yael. So until now, we were good. Chalitzas were perfectly fine. There was only zika of one person at a time. But now Yael's husband dies, Yisachar, and Yael she's stuck now because now it's not the issue that there's zika of two sisters, it's the issue of achot chalutzato, right? Where they already did chalitza with her sister, each one, there's only two brothers left, and there's one more extra person here of the woman. She needs chalitza either from a third brother, which there is none, or from, right, it would have to be a sixth brother from the beginning, or each of them are going to have to do chalitza, and therefore, chalatz lahai. So Reuven does chalitza with her, mafka zikato. He gets rid of the zika, and chalatz lahai, mafkir zikato. Right. So Reuven and Shimon both have to do chalitza with Yael. Okay. Next, Shmuel amal. So now the Gemara asks, v'hama Rav and zika. But wait, this whole thing was based on zika, and Rav doesn't hold zika. So now we're really stuck because we just explained this whole thing based on Rav holding zika. So no problem. The divrei haomer yesh zika kamar. There is someone who holds, there's a debate about what Rav actually held, so it's according to the one who holds, there's zika. Ushmuel amal, and we'll just start with Shmuel now, but we'll explain it much better next time. There's going to be two different explanations. Echad choletz the kulan. So we're building on the last case now, where one dies, Reuven does chalitza with Tamar. Yehuda dies, Shimon does chalitza with Ruth. Then Yisachar dies, what happens? Echad choletz lekulan. Reuven can do chalitza. So wait, I said it wrong here. The chart wasn't wrong. Let's check. Right, sorry. Reuven did chalitza with Tamar. When Yehuda dies, Reuven does chalitza with Ruth also. And then when Yael dies, Reuven does chalitza with her as well. What Shmuel is saying is not that this is what has to be, but one could potentially do chalitza with all three. We're going to have to understand what Shmuel is basing this on, right? Possibly ain't zika, because if there's no zika, then Reuven has no problem doing chalitza with all of these women, even if, let's say, they all die at the same time. Anyway, we'll get to understanding Shimon much better in tomorrow's class when we get to two different interpretations of what really Shmuel said. With that, we'll end today's shir. Have a Shavua Tov or Shabbat Shalom to everyone.